The first time Margaret Holloway walked into Dunbar's salvage yard, the men behind the counter didn't even look up from their coffee. She was 53 years old, wearing her late husband's old work jacket, and carrying a folder of paperwork for a tractor engine the yard had listed as scrap metal. "That one's done," said Roy Dunbar, barely glancing at her. "Cylinders cracked, blocks warped. Go home, lady, before you waste your money." Margaret didn't go home. She bought the engine for $200, paid in cash, and had it hauled to the back lot of the farm she had inherited 3 months earlier when her husband Walter passed away. The farm was 40 acres of overgrown fields, a leaning barn, and a farmhouse that hadn't been painted since the Reagan administration. Everyone in the county, including her own grown children, had told her to sell it. "You don't know the first thing about farming," her son David had said over the phone. "You were a school librarian, Mom. Sell the land, take the money, move into town." But Margaret remembered something her father had told her decades earlier, back when she used to help him rebuild lawnmower engines in their garage in Ohio. He used to say that nothing mechanical was ever really dead. It was just waiting for someone patient enough to listen to what was actually wrong with it. Walter had taught her the rest over 30 years of marriage. The two of them tinkering with farm equipment on weekends, not because they had to, but because Margaret loved it. She had degrees in literature and library science, but her hands had always been happiest covered in grease. So she spent that first winter in the barn, under a single hanging bulb, taking the engine apart piece by piece. The cylinder wasn't cracked the way Roy had assumed. It was score, which was a very different and far less expensive problem. The block wasn't warped either. Someone had simply installed a gasket wrong years before, and the heat damage that followed had been misdiagnosed ever since as terminal. Margaret ordered the parts she needed from a supplier 3 states away, taught herself the torque specifications from a manual she found in a library archive, and worked every evening after her part-time shifts at the local elementary school where she'd taken a job shelving books just to keep the lights on. By March, the engine started on the second try. Margaret sat in the cab of the old tractor, hands shaking, and cried for the first time since Walter's funeral. That tractor became the heart of everything. With it running, she could finally clear the fields that had gone wild for 2 seasons. She planted soybeans the first year because a neighbor named Carl Whitfield, one of the few people in the area who didn't treat her like a curiosity, told her soybeans were forgiving for a first-time farmer, and the regional buyer paid fair prices without asking too many questions about who was driving the planter. The harvest wasn't large, it barely covered her seed costs and the property taxes, but it was hers, and it was real, and it proved something she had needed to prove to herself more than to anyone else. Word travels strangely in farming country. Gun moves through feed stores and church parking lots and the line at the grain elevator, and within a year, people who had once snickered about the librarian out on the old Holloway place were asking Margaret to look at their broken equipment. A combine that wouldn't start, a grain auger with an electrical short nobody could trace, a 40-year-old diesel engine that 3 different mechanics had declared beyond saving. Margaret fixed all of it. Not because she was magic, and not because she had some gift the men around her lacked, but because she did something most of them had stopped doing. She actually listened to the machine before she diagnosed it. She didn't assume and chased it. She measured. She traced wires with a multimeter instead of guessing. And when something didn't make sense, she sat with the problem instead of forcing an answer onto it. By the 3rd year, Margaret wasn't just fixing her own equipment. She had built a small reputation as the person to call when everyone else had given up. She charged fair rates, kept meticulous records, and reinvested almost everything back into the farm. She bought a second tractor, another supposed write-off, sold to her for almost nothing by a dealer who assumed she'd never get it running. She got that one running too, within 6 weeks. Roy Dunbar, the same man who had told her to go home, showed up at her gate 2 years after that first sale. His own equipment had failed during planting season, and every mechanic within 50 miles was booked solid. He stood at her gate looking deeply uncomfortable, hat in his hands. "I heard you might be able to look at my baler," he said. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't bring up what he'd said in the salvage yard, though she remembered every word of it. She simply nodded, grabbed her toolbox, and asked him to describe exactly what the baler was doing wrong. It turned out to be a simple sensor failure, the kind of thing that looked catastrophic to someone who didn't know where to look, but took her under an hour to resolve. "How much do I owe you?" Roy asked afterward, clearly bracing for a number that would sting, maybe as a kind of fair payback for his earlier rudeness. "Same as everybody else," Margaret said, and quoted her standard rate. Roy paid without argument, and from that day on, whenever someone at the feed store made a comment about that woman out on the Holloway farm, Roy was the first to correct them. He told the story often, usually against himself, about the time he'd told Margaret Holloway to go home, and she'd built an entire operation instead. Margaret's days that first full year settled into a rhythm she never could have predicted as a librarian. She woke before dawn, fed the few chickens she'd started keeping for her own kitchen, and spent the cool morning hours in the barn before the heat made the metal too uncomfortable to touch. She learned to read the small signs that something was wrong before it became a real problem. A faint rattle that meant a bearing was wearing thin, a slight hesitation on startup that meant fuel lines needed cleaning, a smell of burning rubber that meant a belt was about to fail. None of it came naturally at first. She made mistakes, plenty of them. She once spent an entire weekend chasing an electrical fault only to discover the battery terminal had simply corroded loose. She laughed about that one for years afterward, telling new customers the story as a way of putting them at ease about their own confusion. Carl Whitfield, the neighbor who had first pointed her towards soybeans, became something close to a mentor, though he would have waved off the title if she'd ever used it to his face. He was in his 70s, had farmed the same land his whole life, and had buried 2 wives and outlived most of his old friends. He showed up unannounced one afternoon during her second spring, found her elbow deep in a planter's gearbox, and simply pulled up a stool and started handing her tools before she'd even asked. "You've got good instincts," he told her that day. "Most folks around here, they learn this from their daddies. You're learning it from the machine itself. That's slower, but it sticks better." He taught her things no manual covered: how to tell by the sound of an engine whether the timing was off, how to judge soil moisture by feel well enough to know when to plant without waiting on a forecast, how to barter fairly with suppliers without either side feeling cheated. In return, Margaret fixed his equipment for free for the rest of his working years, an arrangement neither of them ever wrote down because neither of them needed to. The farm grew the way most real things grow, slowly, with setbacks woven through the progress. The late frost wiped out an early planting in her 4th year and put her budget back months. A buyer who promised a contract for her soybeans backed out at the last minute, leaving her to scramble for a new market in under a week. She lost a finished field once to a sudden hailstorm that flattened the crop 2 days before harvest, and she sat on her porch that night and allowed herself exactly 1 evening of grief before getting back up the next morning to assess what could still be salvaged. What kept her steady through all of it was a habit she'd carried over from her years as a librarian. She kept records of everything. Every repair, every part number, every cost, every yield, every mistake. Where other farmers in the area worked mostly from memory and instinct, Margaret built spreadsheets. She tracked which fields performed best with which rotations, which equipment needed preventive maintenance on which schedule, which suppliers gave honest prices and which didn't. Within a few years, her records were detailed enough that she could predict, almost to the dollar, what a given season would cost her and what it might return. That precision became its own kind of advantage. While neighboring farms bled money on equipment that broke down at the worst possible moment, Margaret's machines, all maintained on her own meticulous schedule, rarely failed during the seasons that mattered most. While other small operations gambled on a single crop and hoped for good prices, Margaret diversified early, adding a modest orchard of apple and pear trees in her 5th year. Then a flock of laying hens, the year after, that brought in steady weekly income from local markets that didn't depend on commodity prices at all. The orchard had been Walter's old dream, one he'd talked about for years but never gotten around to starting. Margaret found his hand-drawn sketches in a desk drawer one winter evening. Rows of trees marked out in pencil along the south slope where the drainage was best, and she decided, almost on impulse, to finally plant it. She ordered the saplings the following spring, planted them herself over 3 exhausting weekends, and told herself she'd give it 5 years before judging whether it had been a sensible decision or simply a sentimental one. By the 3rd year, the young trees were already producing a modest crop, and by the 5th, the orchard was supplying a roadside stand that local families had started visiting every weekend during harvest season, drawn as much by the apple butter and fresh cider Margaret had taught herself to make as by the fruit itself. The laying hens came about almost by accident. A local family, moving out of state, offered her their flock for almost nothing, rather than transport the birds across the country. And Margaret, never one to turn down a fair deal, said yes before she'd fully thought through what keeping 40 hens would actually involve. It turned out to be far less complicated than she'd feared, and the eggs sold steadily at the farmer's market in town every Saturday morning. Often before she'd even finished setting up her table, she started keeping a small notebook of record and customers' preferences, the way she once kept track of which patrons at the library favored which authors. And within a year, she had a loyal following who arrived early specifically for her eggs. By her 7th year on the farm, Margaret Holloway employed 2 part-time hands during harvest season, had paid off the remaining debt on the property, and had expanded her operation to include a small repair business that serviced equipment for a dozen surrounding farms. She still did the diagnostic work herself, walking each customer through exactly what had gone wrong and why. The same way she once explained a difficult passage of literature to a confused student. People didn't just want their equipment fixed. They wanted to understand it. Margaret gave them both. Her son David, the same one who had urged her to sell, came to visit during her 8th harvest. He stood at the edge of a field watching his mother climb down from a combine she had rebuilt almost entirely with her own hands, watched her direct her 2 hired hands with the easy authority of someone who had earned every bit of her confidence, and he didn't say much. Later that evening, over dinner at the kitchen table that had been in the family for 3 generations, he finally spoke. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I'm sorry I doubted you." Margaret reached over and patted his hand. "You weren't wrong to worry," she said. "You just didn't know yet what I was capable of." Neither did I, really, not until I had to find out. By the time an agricultural magazine ran a feature on her operation in her 10th year, a story that several local papers picked up and reprinted, much to Margaret's quiet amusement, the farm that everyone had told her to sell was independently appraised at just over $2 million. The figure accounted for the land itself, which had appreciated steadily as development crept closer to the county. The fully restored equipment fleet that Margaret had built piece by piece from machines other people had discarded. The orchard now entering full production. The laying operation and the established repair business that brought in steady income 12 months a year, independent of weather or harvest. When a reporter asked her what she would say to the man who had once told her to go home, Margaret laughed. The easy laugh of someone who had long since made peace with how the story started. "I'd thank him," she said. "He told me the engine was scrap. He just didn't know that scrap is only scrap until somebody decides to actually look at it properly. That's true of engines. It turned out to be true of me, too." She still keeps that first engine, fully restored, parked at the edge of her driveway, where every visitor can see it. There's a small hand-painted sign beside it that reads simply, $200. Everyone said it was worthless. Listen before you give up on something. Margaret never did go home. Not in the way Roy Dunbar meant it that first day in the salvage yard. Instead, she made a home out of the very ground people assumed would defeat her. One patient repair, one careful season, one stubborn refusal to accept someone else's verdict at a time. And on quiet evenings, when the chores were done and the light was fading gold across the orchard rows, she would sometimes walk out to that first old tractor parked by the driveway, rest a hand on its cooling hood, and simply say, "Thank you," the way she might have thanked an old friend who had taught her something she hadn't known she needed to learn.